Alright guys, so we're going to talk through some of the components of a seated leg curl because understanding some of the different moving parts here can help you to understand this exercise better, but also to understand some of the other exercises that you're going to be performing in the gym, especially machine type exercises. So first things first, when we kind of look at a seated leg curl in general, both Paddy and I kind of agree that it's probably like the best hamstring exercise you could do. If you were to be reductionistic and say what's the best hamstring exercise, it's probably one of the ones that's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck, and that's for a couple of different reasons. So firstly, you're taking the hamstrings through a very large range of motion, including their stretch position. So you're taking them fully into that lengthened range, because if we think back to the anatomy content that we've presented, the hamstrings do two things primarily, and that is extend the hip, so hip extension, but also knee flexion. So your hamstring is going to be fully shortened when the hip is extended and the knee is flexed. Okay, so that means that in order to get the hamstrings into a stretch position, we need to have hip flexion and knee extension. Okay, so when we have that position where the hip is flexed and we've got the knee extended, that's when we're going to get those hamstrings into a stretch position. So from a kind of a general training perspective, building muscle, for example, we know that, you know, getting muscles into that lengthened portion of their range is quite beneficial. And in this case, where we can really control that and be very specific about what our endpoint is, it's a really nice way of applying that, you know, because by nature of using, or by the nature of the machine, you're able to be in control of every part of that range of motion. And because it's just a hamstring, you're really able to focus on that, you know. It's very similar in some ways to a standard kind of Romanian deadlift or stiff leg deadlift, where again, you're getting the hamstrings into that lengthened range, but the difference there being that there's also a lot of other moving parts. So sometimes what you might find is that your lower back might fatigue before your hamstrings actually do, and you don't know if you've really taken them to the point where they're the limiting factor. Whereas in this case, with the seated leg curl, there's basically no doubt, because the hamstrings are going to be the prime movers, along with, you know, your calf muscles to some degree. They will be contributing. The gastrocnemius in particular does contribute to knee flexion, but you really are going to find that this is a real hamstring killer, so to speak. So whether it's strength, whether it's muscle building, or whether it's actually kind of sports specificity from a rehab perspective or an injury prevention perspective, this is a really, really nice one. Because when we do take those muscles into their lengthened range, that is going to allow us to kind of reduce the tendency for injury in a sporting context, because we've gotten used to absorbing those high forces in lengthened range positions. So, you know, one of the positions you could potentially pick up a hamstring injury in, let's say GA, for example, is when you're going to kick a ball. What you might find is that with the legs out in front like that, the hip is flexed, the knee is extended, and under those high forces, sometimes that can tweak someone's hamstring. So in this case, we're really starting to develop that bit of resilience in the hamstring muscles in their lengthened range. So along with the fact that, you know, we're dealing with that specific point of the range of motion, what we're also dealing with here is the knee flexion function. So it's not just like the RDL. You know, you can say the RDL is giving you that lengthened range challenge, but it's not giving you a knee flexion challenge. So in this case, you're also getting a knee flexion challenge, and you're also getting a number of components of this machine that allow you to really be stable and maximize your force output. Because what we've got here are these restraints here. So when you've got a thigh pad that runs across the top like this is the ideal for a seated leg curl. What you don't want is the type of restraint that runs across the top of the shin. It just doesn't really make any mechanical sense to have that. So, you know, if you are ever trying to choose a hamstring machine, maybe you're a personal trainer and you're thinking of investing in one for the gym, generally you want one with this thigh pad that runs across. So what that allows you to do, this thigh pad, is when you're in that top position where the legs are straight, if Paddy puts his legs up, he's going to be applying force here. So we have to remember that the knee joint is an axis. So we're talking about rotary motion. So we're talking about rotation, where the leg is going to come down and around. So at the beginning, our force is going to be applied directly towards the floor. So as Paddy pulls his ankle down, it's going down that way. So that's the direction of our initial force application. So what you have to think about is what the compensatory movement for that would be. So if he's pulling pulling this down, his knees want to move up. So you can see his knees are lifting up there, his upper thigh is lifting up off the pad. So what we need to do then is apply some sort of restraint so that he can maximize his force output there. And that's what this thigh pad essentially functions as, because he's able to brace his thighs up against this thigh pad and maximize force output then in that direction. But as I said, the nature of the movement does change from start to finish. So at the beginning, he's applying all of his force downward, but at the end, he's applying all his force horizontally. So we've gone from vertical force application to horizontal force application when he's down there. So then if we think what the compensatory movement there is going to be, if he's pulling back with his ankles, his body wants to move forward, okay? So if there was no restraints at all, and he was to really pull back as hard as he could, he'd just fall forward. So the benefit here in this machine in particular is that you've got the thigh pad, but you've also got these handles on top. So as Paddy pushes himself back, he's actually creating restraint and stability in that bottom position as well. So now we've got a situation where we've got bracing or restraint or points of stability in both directions that we would actually need to. So what we basically end up with is a situation where the main moving part is that lower leg, and that's it. So any effort that he is putting out is going directly to challenging those hamstrings. So this is a good example of really, breaking things down, stabilizing everything that we can, and just having that moving part that we're actually trying to train. And you can certainly make a case for trying to do that when you're trying to focus on just hamstring development. When we're not thinking, okay, the whole posterior chain like a deadlift variation. We're thinking, how can we best train these hamstrings? And that's really what this seated leg curl allows you to start doing. So from there, you do want to have a think about how some of these machine variables might affect your client's ability to perform the exercise, or how it might vary between different exercise or between different clients rather. So the first thing that you want to be aware of here is the position of your seat, because what some people do is they just hop into the leg curl and they don't actually adjust it from the person who was using it previously. And this is also the case if you have a leg curl where the seat doesn't even adjust, and this isn't uncommon, it's just poor machine design. In this case, the seat moves forward and it moves back. And as a sound kind of rule of thumb that you want to follow, you'll generally have some sort of marker of the axis of rotation. So if you're putting your force in here, it's rotating about this red marker here. So there's a sign there with the arrows going left and the arrows going right, clockwise and counterclockwise. And that basically indicates the point about which this is rotating. So if we think of this as the point of force application, this is basically your leg essentially, because we want our internal axis of the body to be aligning up with the axis of the machine so that we can move without having to change our body during the exercise. So what you will find is that if you don't set this up properly, you will end up with the pad rolling up or down your leg during the exercise, and that then changes the nature of the resistance. Because if Paddy puts his legs up for a moment, in this case, he set it up at an appropriate level, so his knee is in line with the axis of rotation there. So that means that I'm not going to expect this pad to do much rolling during the exercise, because his leg is obviously a fixed segment length, and the machine is a fixed segment length once we've adjusted it. So as a result, they should move nice and smoothly together. And then when we think about the actual kind of mechanics side of things, the moment arm that you're dealing with in terms of actually dictating the resistance is going to be the point between the force application and the actual axis. So that could be the machine itself, or you're talking about the knee, because they're lined up in this case. So if those things are not aligned, what ends up happening is that the resistance changes, because you're dealing with the pad being further down, maybe at the end. See the way it's sliding down his leg? That means that resistance is increasing at the bottom, and now it's decreasing at the top because it's closer to the axis. So you're actually changing the resistance there somewhat by accident. And sometimes what you'll have clients report when that begins to happen is that, oh, it doesn't feel so good at the bottom. I'm finding it really hard at the bottom. Maybe there's a bit of strain at the knee or something like that, because basically their knee is moving around, their lower leg is moving around, and the resistance is changing throughout the range of motion. So if you can start to align those things, you're going to allow the client a better exercise experience, because what you can see here is that pad isn't moving from its position. It's more or less staying within plus or minus 1 centimeter, let's say, of the position that it's actually starting in. And that's because you set up the machine properly. So that's a really important thing to get here, guys. Now, the next thing you might want to be aware of here is the ability to adjust your starting range of motion, because sometimes what you'll see is that, you know, these leg curls, that they're set up really, really high, and it demands you to be able to basically extend your knee fully to full extension, or even push you into hyperextension. So if you don't account for that at all, then you could be starting in a position that's really, really uncomfortable for someone, because what we have to remember is that we are stretching the hamstrings here fundamentally. So that with that knee extended and that hip flexed, then for some of your clients, they may not have previous training experience, and it might be really uncomfortable to get into that starting position, because that's totally within their passive range. So it's as if someone is literally stretching them to get into that position. And that's the type of thing that can turn people away from certain exercises, because they're like, it's so uncomfortable even getting into it. And also dismounting from it when you're finished the exercise, what can happen is, because the weight pulls them up into a real stretch position, it's just not a nice feeling at all. And that's especially the case, you know, if you're working with a client on a rehab basis, who maybe they have some history of knee pain, or they came to you for that purpose, or even if you're dealing with someone who's going through rehab, hamstring rehab. So if someone's had a hamstring strain and you're using this exercise as a means of building up strength in the hamstring, what you don't want is to be trying to force that person into a stretch position at the beginning or at the end of their repetition. So think in advance how you're actually going to set up the exercise. So if Paddy brings his leg slightly out to the side for me here, if you extend this leg for me, Paddy, I can see, okay, he's got full knee extension there, but I still know that it's going to be pulling him up passively into a stretch position to get him to that height. But to be honest, I'm not too worried about that in Paddy's case, because there's very little resistance there. You know, it's like the difference between what he can get to actively and what I can pull him to passively. It's not too much of a big difference. But if I have a client who comes in and they can only extend to that far, which is very common for your clients who say, you know, I could never ever touch my toes, and they can only get that far, do I really want to be pulling them and pulling them and pulling them to try and force them into that position? Probably not. And this again is the difference between just thinking of exercises in terms of an arbitrary full range of motion and a range of motion that might be more appropriate for your actual clients. So that's something to play around with. So if I had that client who could they could only extend up that far, I might say, okay, that's no problem, you know, let's start from that range of motion instead. And then what you can do is you can treat this like you might, you know, some sort of flexibility program, because you are still taking that muscle into its lengthened range at this point in time. And then you might say, you know, that's something we might progress over time, because someone can build up tolerance to that lengthened range, they build strength there, and as they build up that tolerance, it's not going to be, you know, as damaging from a muscle damage and a delayed onset muscle soreness perspective. And they're going to build up tolerance to that lengthened range position. So that again is something that you want to be aware of here. So just remember, guys, you can adjust the segment lengths on most of these machines. So you can adjust the segment length there, you can adjust the position of the seat. That's all allowing you to align the knee up with the axis and making sure that pad is actually in a comfortable position for your client. So in general, what you'll want is that it's above the ankle joint and it's in a nice comfortable position for the person. You don't want to start it off that it's just on the heels, because it's going to demand them to basically keep their foot steady throughout, and it's going to demand that there's no rolling at all, and obviously you don't want it rolling off the end of someone's foot. So that's most of the moving parts that you're dealing with here, and just remember those points of restraint are really, really helpful here. So, you know, on an actual cueing note, what you might tell someone at the beginning of the repetition is, if you do a rep or two for me, Paddy, there, if he sets up in a way that's comfortable for him, what I would be guiding him on here is, right, at the start of the rep, what I want you to think about is driving that thigh up into that pad and shoving down towards the floor. So that's your starting point. You're thinking about, right, drive the thighs up because you've got that restraint. And then at the bottom, I wanted to really emphasize pushing back here, and imagine he's trying to pull himself forward. So they're just some of the things that you can start to think about here, but just remind your clients, you know, just give them a quick note why this is important, you know, and they'll start to feel it for themselves. Because as we can see there, Paddy's not moving about on the seat. All that's happening is that he's actually starting to move at the knee joint, and that's literally all that's moving. Now, We spoke a little bit about kind of challenging the length and range and stuff like that. And another thing you can do here is very simply adjust the position of the body. So let's say like we've obviously got that at our disposal with adjusting the height of the range of motion, but you've also got just body position itself. So if Paddy sits forward here, that's the equivalent of him adding a further stretch to the hamstrings, because obviously the knee is fully extended here, but now he's flexing the hip further, so those hamstrings are really starting to get into a length and range position now. So that's going to be ideal for trying to train the extreme of someone's range of motion, because the further he can lean forward into it, the more his hamstrings are going to be lengthened throughout the range of motion. Now that's something you might want to do if you have a specific goal of this exercise. If you're saying, okay, I want to really try and develop that length and range strength with this client. You don't just do it for, every single client, because obviously some individuals are going to find that to be quite an extreme position for them, and you mightn't want to force them right into it. So in general, what you want to remember here, the further you're sitting forward, especially if it's the case that your machine is fixed and you can't adjust it, you might want to think about how does that influence the joint ranges and the muscle lengths that we're working with. So you're going to be working with a longer muscle here and a slightly shorter muscle there, because as he lies back, he's actually extending the hip again, and hence the hamstring is in a more lengthened position, or in a more shortened position rather. So that's just something to be aware of, guys. And as you can see, there's lots of moving parts here, and there are lessons to be taken away from this that translate to other exercises. So have a think about body position. Have a think about what restraints are in place on different machines. Have a think about what the relationship between the joint axis of interest and the axis of the machine is, and then you can start to get a better idea of why someone might be experiencing a certain phenomenon, such as the pad rolling up and down, because all of this can be brought back to very basic mechanics and just understanding, right, what's going on in the machine. So if you work in a gym, you're a personal trainer, have a look at the machines that are in your gym, see what some of the moving parts are, see if you can figure them out. And of course, if you're unsure, you can ask us in the Coach's Corner. We'll give you guidance on that. So hopefully that was helpful, guys. Hopefully you can put some of these tips into practice. And again, as we say in all the videos, start to work with more clients and individualize the exercises for those individuals that you're working with.